Hello everyone. I'm going to give you an overview of blockchain regulation from my experience in the past 4 years as being a blockchain lawyer and assisting businesses, innovative blockchain businesses, get regulated and become compliant. As a legal assistant to these businesses, we've witnessed how policies have emerged into laws and how this environment is changing quite rapidly. So there are a couple of priority areas. Um, First is how to regulate virtual currencies, or how are they being regulated at the moment. Um, the next is looking at the initial coin offering, which is a fairly new uh, phenomena within virtual currency. New in the sense that it's becoming more common to see nowadays, but it's something there's certain priority attached to it because people are raising significant amounts of money through this mechanism. All it is essentially is to create your own virtual currency, and by the creation of that virtual currency, you are selling it to the general public in advance, and that is financing the development of whatever project you're doing. So it's becoming a very efficient crowdfunding financing tool. Then we're going to look a little bit about tax treatment, because I think it's really important uh, when thinking about the regulation of virtual currencies to be aiming towards a certain amount of legal certainty. And um, one of the priorities should be that people should know how they're going to be taxed. So that's a priority, at least for me. And then a little bit about regulatory technology and what would be a proactive approach when regulating blockchain technology. So first is the regulation of Bitcoin. So here I'm talking about Bitcoin, but the term could be used interchangeably with other virtual currencies. There are many out there. There are over 800. There are thousands of them, in fact. So, when I talk about Bitcoin, I'm talking essentially about a certain type of virtual currency, which is decentralized in the sense that it is not a payment system which is operated by a central administrator. Um, in the sense, if you look at PayPal, for instance, that is a payment system that's managed by a central administrator. So it's decentralized. And so we're going to look a little bit at how it's regulated and how people are able to comply. So the first thing is, what is a virtual currency? These are peer-to-peer private currencies, effectively. There's no reliance on any central bank or central authority for them to work. Their characteristic is that of a bearer asset. A bearer asset is an instrument which, when you hold it in your possession, you are the de facto owner of it. So cash, the cash in your pocket, is a bearer asset. You have it, when you pass it to someone else, they de facto become the legal owner of it. And the same is true with virtual currencies in their current form. They are bearer assets. The most well-known of these virtual currencies are Bitcoin and Ethereum. There are many other, of course, as I explained. They act as a store of value, but also a means to transfer value. And Ethereum, the latter example there, is a platform, effectively, a decentralized platform, peer-to-peer platform, where you can build applications. So the currency, if you will, the coin, is used to power those applications. So commonly they can be referred to as app coins, application coins. So in a very, very basic form, they store value and used to transfer value, but they can also be used to power applications. Now, what kind of Bitcoin businesses? Again, as I said, it's just a generic term, Bitcoin, and not just referring to Bitcoin, the currency that we are used to and that's worth over $3,600 today. The type of Bitcoin businesses are exchange facilities. These are marketplaces where people can exchange Bitcoin for fiat currencies, which are government-issued currencies. Then you have the Bitcoin processing businesses. This is a service which allows for merchants to sell goods and receive payment in Bitcoin, and for that Bitcoin to be converted into fiat currency. And then we have Bitcoin payments, which is a remittance service effectively that just does not use SWIFT for settlement or Visa or MasterCard for settlement, but rather uses Bitcoin for the settlement process. There's another business that's becoming more and more commonplace, which is bank cards for virtual currencies. So these are people that have a wallet containing a number of virtual currencies in them, and they access the value through a bank card, often a prepaid card. So card issuing is another type of Bitcoin business. The question is, before we talk about regulation, we ask whether it should be regulated. The key aspect is, where are the risks of within the sector? One of the very basic risks is AML. When you have an instrument which acts as a bearer asset such as cash can be fairly vulnerable to criminal abuse. As we know, cash is the most common instrument used for criminal activities because it's less traceable. Virtual currency is a little bit different because it is more traceable than cash, because it's attached. All transactions are attached to blockchain, which is effectively just a public ledger showing every single transaction. So what's the impetus behind regulation in this area? The impetus is mainly to manage the risk of the technology being used for money laundering and terrorist financing. And secondly, there is an element of consumer protection. Not many people know how to use the technology, etc. It's quite difficult to determine who are the good and bad actors, and therefore consumers need some way of being protected. In relation to AML, the United States was the first actually to regulate this area. FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, federal authority, decided that they would regulate Bitcoin businesses and that they would be required to register as a money service business in the United States. This requires exchanges and processors to register with FinCEN and comply with AML laws. Now, as you know, the United States is a federal and state level system, so even though they're registered at a federal level, some of the same businesses also need to undertake a licensing process at the state level. Other countries, now more recently Japan has stepped in to regulate Bitcoin businesses. They are capturing Bitcoin businesses, in particular exchanges, under payment services law. So the service of providing an exchange service is regulated now in Japan. Isle of Man, in roughly 2005, started to regulate Bitcoin exchanges and the issuance, so the creation of new types of Bitcoins, new types of virtual currencies. Under the focus here was anti-money laundering laws. Luxembourg regulates Bitcoin exchange activity under EU payment laws. The first entity to receive a license was Bitstamp, and they are based in Luxembourg. Now, the EU more broadly as a region is regulating Bitcoin activity at least by the end of this year under the 4th Anti-Money Laundering Directive. This will require Bitcoin businesses engaging in exchange or custodian services, if you weren't holding on to Bitcoin for other people, that they would be required to comply with anti-money laundering laws. Gibraltar is an interesting one because they are focusing in on consumer protection or a more prudential regime for virtual currencies. So as of the beginning of next year, Gibraltar will be regulating custodianship service. So this is anyone who is looking after Bitcoins or virtual currencies for other people. Now, in terms of what the scope of that regulation, it goes beyond simply AML compliance. They're also looking at consumer protection. So what security mechanisms are in place to ensure that private keys, which is the basis of virtual currency because it's based on cryptography, that they are well looked after and that consumers have a certain service level that they can expect from those service providers. So Gibraltar is taking a very interesting slant, which is focusing in on consumer protection and custodianship services. Now let's look a little bit at Bitcoin itself and how it's been risk categorized more broadly. FATF, which sets international policy, has deemed Bitcoin to be high risk. This is primarily due to it having bearer asset qualities. Now, what measures does FATF suggest to mitigate that risk? FATF recommends the use of technology, primarily RegTech, as a necessary tool for compliance. This involves maximum data collection, which could be IP address collection, and the use of the blockchain itself as this public ledger, store of all transactions, as a beginning foundation for record keeping. So FATF on one hand is deemed to be fairly high risk, but is saying here are some of the mitigating measures that you need to do to mitigate the risk. And primary mitigating measure is the use of technology and the collection of information there with that technology. So there are some RegTech tools available. Some of these RegTech tools, they will assist with transaction origin monitoring, and well, this entails essentially looking at the blockchain broadly and determining whether a transaction is associated either with dark market activity, so the likes of the Silk Road or those types of markets, or whether the transaction is associated with what's known as mixing services, which is where transaction is broken up into small pieces and then is reconstituted later. This mixing service is a way of dissimulating the origin of Bitcoin, and is used for fairly legitimate reasons because you have Bitcoin, which is a public ledger. The blockchain is a public ledger. So if you give your Bitcoin address to someone, they can see what your balance is on this public ledger. So you want to protect your financial privacy by using a mixing service. But mixing services are, of course, used by criminals who have received Bitcoin, say from ransomware, and that they want to dissimulate the origin of Bitcoin. So RegTech is a necessary foundation piece. We work with a group called CoinFirm. CoinFirm provide this RegTech service where you can provide a Bitcoin address and they will tell you the risk categorization of it based on its origin. Let's move to the next section. So we've looked at Bitcoin, how it is regulated, where it is regulated in the world, and some of the ways of mitigating the risks associated with Bitcoin. Let's look at part 2, which is looking at new phenomena within virtual currencies, which is the ICO, the initial coin offering. So there are two things really that were extremely innovative with virtual currency. The first is, well, it's blockchain more broadly. So it's blockchain technology more broadly. The first is a decentralized payment system, which is Bitcoin and virtual currencies. And then second is decentralized crowdfunding, which is now coming to fruition with the initial coin offerings. So you may be aware of crowdfunding. It's a fairly commonplace activity now throughout the world. where companies, startups can use a platform where they can raise some initial funds to kickstart their idea. In fact, Kickstarter were the first to initiate this idea of crowdfunding. That was for the development of new innovative products, but the idea spun off for equity crowdfunding, which is raising money for shares for new ideas. And now we have the same idea creating a new generation of crowdfunding where new virtual currencies being sold to power a new blockchain innovation. So the differences with traditional crowdfunding and ICOs is that the ICO market is a much bigger market. In fact, it has eclipsed the VC market. This is partly because Bitcoin and Ethereum and other virtual currencies have increased in such a significant value that it's created a number of millionaires who are re-injecting their capital within the ecosystem. And so now we are seeing ICOs raising between 10 to 200 million for their projects. These start off generally with a white paper of what they want to do and how they want to deploy the capital, and people then invest. Let's look a little bit at the risks of these ICOs. I think it's important to understand that a lot of these ICOs are not using any KYC, so they are not identifying their customers. So you have good and bad actors and fairly indifferent actors that are doing ICOs. Some of the bad actors are using ICOs as a means of perpetuating Ponzi schemes. There are instances of market manipulation. There are also instances of money laundering, where people are using an ICO to launder funds. We can look at a couple of the ICOs that are taking place at the moment. EOS, they've raised over $200 million US. They are doing an ICO which will last for approximately a year. There is no KYC on their ICO at all. Bancor raised around 150 million in roughly 3 hours. Basic attention token roughly 30 million. Status around 60 million. A lot of the ICOs are set up in Switzerland. They are not required to do KYC when they are doing their ICO. And so for people that want to avoid KYC, it's an attractive offering. For myself, we at Diacool do not do any ICOs which are not compliant in the sense of doing KYC, and we typically will use the Isle of Man. Isle of Man is the only jurisdiction which will provide a license to do a token offering, and the condition of the license is that you must comply with AML laws. Okay, so let's move on to what the status is really in terms of regulation. We're seeing actually that, well, I'm seeing at least that more and more blockchain businesses want to be regulated. The good actors, they want some legal certainty around their business. They want to be considered as serious innovators. Our point of view, at least at Diacool, is to encourage ICO activity, but within the remit of compliance, and to ensure that they comply with AML laws in doing that. Because a lot of businesses, they want the innovation, they want the certainty, and they don't want to be looking over their shoulder, and they want to also be able to engage with every institution and stakeholder. So it's important, compliance. And it's an education process, so we always talk with people through the process and why it's important, and why it's important to protect their business and protect them as founders. It's interesting to note, however, that from our experience with speaking to regulators, that they find blockchain businesses are the ones that are regulated are actually some of the most compliant businesses compared to the other businesses that they regulate. Why? Because they use technology in a very innovative way. They think laterally about compliance, and this is the actual feedback I've been receiving from the Isle of Man regulator and FinCEN. So for the good actors that want to get regulated and want to do ICOs and want to do things the correct way, subject to AML, you'll find that actually there's a trend of those people that they do things in a better way than other people that are regulated. So that's a very good trend. Alright, so that's the ICO market. So the ICO market is an emerging market. It's raising significant amounts of funds, but it needs regulation of some sort. The AML regulation is a no-brainer. It's needed to protect the founders and to ensure that the funds are derived from legitimate origin. And the only jurisdiction where you can do that really is the Isle of Man, and of course a registration with FinCEN for that token issuance. Right, moving to tax treatment. So virtual currency is one of those things that is never going to go away. It will be there until the end of time, until the end of the internet, because it's decentralized and it's very popular. So, just as gold kind of entered into human existence, virtual currency is now entered into human existence and will not go away. So the question is how to regularize this new asset within one's economy. It's not possible to ban it. If you do, it will go underground. So you have to regularize it within the economy. And the first thing to do is to give a very clear tax treatment associated with virtual currencies as assets. In the US, they define it as property. The UK, it's defined as a payment instrument. In some other countries, it's simply treated as foreign exchange. There are very few countries in the world now that apply VAT to virtual currency. EU has waived VAT, so sales tax, from virtual currencies. So it's very, very commonplace now to remove the need for sales tax on virtual currency sales. What's very important is that auditors are familiarized with virtual currency operations. And this presents a bit of a problem because there aren't many professionals involved in virtual currencies. So we need to train auditors, we need to train accountants, we need to get them familiarized with virtual currencies. And the way of doing that is first having very clear tax guidelines. So the UK was one of the first countries in the world, partly due to our impetus, because we created an association called the UK DCA, where we spoke to government, we spoke to HMRC, and we said, look, we need some clarity here. And they were very happy to give us that clarity. It took about a year, but eventually they did. And it was a very comprehensive framework, which gave a lot of legal certainty to people. So tax treatment is a really, really important area to concentrate on, even before AML. In terms of categorization of virtual currencies, from a tax point of view, payment instruments or financial instruments, from a tax point of view, they're usually not subject to sales tax, so it can be a good way of being categorized. But as I said, it doesn't make any sense to apply VAT to virtual currency. Alright, so let's move on to another area, which is RegTech. Regulatory technology, the use of technology to enhance regulation, enhance the monitoring, prevent breaches. RegTech is a phenomenal area. It's really going to revolutionize the way that regulation happens in the world. And blockchain is basically RegTech. It is a public ledger. It provides transparency, and that technology can be used in a multitude of different ways. And it creates this relationship between the regulator and the regulated, which is unparalleled. Normally we're used to a relationship where the regulated entity stores data in its own database, and then when the regulator says, please send me that data, and then we'll send an email with, X amounts of Excel spreadsheets and supporting documentation. Whereas with blockchain, the difference is there's no need for the regulated to have its own database. It would have a shared database which is based on blockchain technology with the regulator, so that in real time the regulator can see exactly what that person is doing. So blockchain itself is really one of the most powerful RegTech tools on the planet. And what's amazing about blockchain is that it offers the ability to program compliance into the blockchain. So we saw earlier Ethereum. Ethereum, the token Ether, is used to pay for to power applications on the blockchain. So the same, you can write a compliance application on Ethereum, which would be paid for in Ether. And that compliance application could set a number of rules over how tokens can be transferred, etc. Basically, the point here is that a distributed ledger and blockchain can offer the ability to set a number of business rules and to embed them into a program, a distributed program, which is called a smart contract, and ensure that that is adhered to at all times, that it never changes, that the business process of a business who is regulated, that if they're using this piece of distributed software, that the regulator will know that as long as they're using that software, they cannot breach any regulations. So it's fascinating, the areas that this will open up for regulators. Here's a bit of a split of the businesses now involved in RegTech. From my point of view, this split will primarily be dominated by blockchain players over the next 5 years. At the moment, it's AI, big data, things like that, rule-based controls. But in about 5 years, most of these will be blockchain players. So there's one area I'd like to focus on, because we talked a bit about virtual currencies as bearer assets and the high risk categorization attached to them. But that's because blockchain is a neutral technology. We can just add another layer on top of blockchain that will create natural regulation. So one thing that we are doing is we're inventing a new protocol called BlockPass. Have a look at it, blockpass.org, which will create a new virtual currency architecture. You can see that virtual currency networks, they are there and they're decentralized. And then the top will be a ID enabled protocol. So this will allow for transactions but on the blockchain between registered users. And so these assets on the ledger will no longer be bearer assets, but will be registered assets. This will change the categorization of those assets from high risk to low risk. In fact, if you were to create electronic money on a distributed ledger with an ID protocol enabled, those funds held in that distributed software would be cleaner than bank money, because you would have the full history of all transactions involving those tokens. So this is our objective, is to create an alternative trend, registered virtual currencies, which are linked to identities rather than just being bearer assets like cash. Right, the last part really is talking about how to regulate. We've covered a number of areas there, but essentially blockchain innovation requires some level of compliance, there's no doubt about it. The approach of regulators should be fairly proactive, and the starting point should be tax. Giving tax certainty to people, that stakeholders, whoever they may be using virtual currencies. With that certainty in mind, we can talk about other risks such as AML. When the AML guidelines are devised, they should be coordinated between the government and the Bitcoin businesses. This is to ensure that the standard is not one that is unachievable, but it's one that is understood and achievable for those businesses. In terms of how to approach this, how to structure blockchain regulation, we say a great starting point would be a sandbox. So, for example, a Ugandan sandbox could, for instance, this is an address to the Ugandan government, to do a Ugandan sandbox, which within that sandbox would provide tax certainty to the businesses who are operating within the sandbox, and of course, as a result, those operating outside. and ensure that those businesses are complying with a certain amount of AML laws, so setting out some guidelines in that respect, and also allowing for other innovation, so allowing for those blockchain businesses or blockchain technology in general to be integrated into the broader financial system, but in a way that's controlled and monitored. So this is a perfect opportunity for a central bank to be involved in innovation. The UK has its own sandbox. We're seeing more and more of those businesses are blockchain businesses. Hong Kong and Singapore have their own sandboxes. So we'd suggest a Ugandan sandbox could be great for testing, to create a framework, some guidelines. Doesn't have to be embedded in regulation, doesn't have to be embedded in law, but more of an informal approach where the central bank would liaise with businesses involved in blockchain and give certain guidelines and negotiate those guidelines with the businesses. Now, what can you do within a sandbox? Of course, those businesses can deploy their own services and fall within the remit of that sandbox, but you can also do other innovative things, such as there could be ideas around issuing shares on the blockchain. That could be done within a sandbox. An alternative could be incorporation of companies on the blockchain. That could be done within the sandbox. Another is, can you allow a blockchain bank to be set up without a mainframe that is done all on a distributed ledger, or any money institution on a distributed ledger, or mobile money on a distributed ledger? All of this kind of stuff can be done within a sandbox. Even a central bank issuing private money, issuing central bank money on distributed ledger. So conclusion is, Bitcoin businesses should fall within AML guidelines, and there should be tax clarity. ICOs, to a certain extent, should fall within those AML guidelines too. RegTech should be used. Blockchain is RegTech, so should be used. And it's important to think about sandboxing. Sandboxing is a methodology of approaching this new innovation and inviting others and exploring that innovation with others. Thank you very much for your time.